What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Today we need to talk about something that is becoming impossible to ignore, because over the last 48 hours, the story is not just that Ukraine is still holding the line. It is that Kyiv is trying to change the logic of the war itself. And it is doing so through drones, robotic systems, deeper industrial partnerships with Europe, and a strategy that is aimed not only at the front line, but at the Russian war machine far behind it. On one side, Volodymyr Zelenskyy is presenting a vision in which robots, long-range drones, interceptors, missiles, and joint production lines with Germany and Norway become the foundation of a more sustainable Ukrainian war effort. While on the other side, Russia is still throwing mass strikes, launching 324 drones and 3 ballistic missiles overnight, even as Ukraine's air defenses reportedly intercepted 309 of those drones. And that alone should tell you that the shape of this phase of the war is changing. Scale against precision, pressure against adaptation, quantity against systems. And then the second huge story of today is that this technological shift is now colliding with the economic story. Because while Ukraine is expanding long-range and robotic warfare, Russia is getting a short-term boost from higher oil prices, with the International Energy Agency saying Russian oil and fuel export revenues rebounded to about $19 billion in March alone, and the IMF lifting Russia's 2026 growth forecast to 1.1%. Yet, at the very exact same time, Vladimir Putin is publicly scolding his own officials after Russia's economy contracted by 1.8% in the first 2 months of 2026. So yes, Moscow is still making money, but that does not mean that the system looks healthy, stable, or comfortable. It means that the Kremlin is being kept afloat by commodity luck, while still bleeding under the pressure. And then, there are several other stories that matter more than they may seem at first glance. Britain says it will send at least 120,000 drones by the end of this year. Germany and Ukraine agreed a defense package worth 4 billion euros that Mykhailo Fedorov says can finance several hundred Patriot missiles. Then Norway says it will support drone production both in Ukraine and on Norwegian territory. And meanwhile, Ukraine keeps hitting Russian industrial and energy-linked facilities, including a petrochemical plant in Sterlitamak in Bashkortostan, about 1,500 kilometers from Ukraine. So today is not just another news day or briefing. Today is a day that shows how far the war is being reorganized around industry, range, adaptation, and attrition. Let's get straight into all of this right now. Here is the most surprising part of today's briefing. Some of the most important Ukrainian battlefield gains right now are not only about who has more men in the trench, but about who can remove men from the most dangerous parts of the battlefield altogether. Zelenskyy said Ukraine, for the very first time, took over a Russian position exclusively with unmanned platforms, with no infantry involved and no losses on Ukraine's side. And he also said that Ukrainian ground robotic systems carried out more than 22,000 missions in just 3 months. Just think about it for a second. 22,000 times a robot went where a soldier otherwise might have had to go. That is not a futuristic PowerPoint presentation anymore. That is already shaping the battlefield. Zelenskyy specifically named systems like Ratel, TerMIT, Ardal, Zmiy, Protector, and Volia, and tied them to a broader Ukrainian ecosystem that also includes millions of FPV drones per year, deep strike systems, interceptors, millions of shells, and long-range missile weapons such as Flamingo, Ruta, and Peklo. This matters because Ukraine is not pretending it can outperform Russia in crude manpower math. It is trying to create a battlefield where Russia's raw quantity becomes less decisive, where exposure is punished faster, where positions are attacked by machines first, and where even tactical actions can be carried out with lower human cost. That is exactly why these robotic and drone stories are not side stories anymore. They are the center of the story now. When a country under constant pressure starts replacing vulnerable human tasks with scalable systems, that changes force preservation, tempo, training requirements, and long-term sustainability. And that is also why the West suddenly looks much more interested in co-producing this stuff as Ukraine, instead of just shipping finished equipment. And that takes us directly to Europe, Because in Berlin, Zelenskyy said Ukraine and Germany were beginning to work on the joint production of advanced drones and other battle-tested defense systems. At the same time, Ukrainian Defense Minister Mykhailo Fedorov said that Germany and Ukraine agreed to a defense package valued at 4 billion euros, which he described as a massive boost to air defense and one that would allow Kyiv to buy several hundred American-made Patriot missiles. Several hundred Patriot missiles. This is no longer just a symbolic press release number. This is a battlefield number, an infrastructure number, a civilian protection number. Now imagine what this means strategically. Germany is not just helping Ukraine survive this month. Germany is helping Ukraine industrialize endurance. And Norway is moving in a very similar direction. Reuters reported that under the new agreement, Norway will support drone production in Ukraine while Ukraine shares data, information and knowledge with Norway. And Ukrainian drones will also be produced on Norwegian territory. Its Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre said that Norway can learn from Ukraine's hard-won experience, and Oslo's long-term funding plan for Kyiv totals some about $28 billion between 2023 and 2030. This is what serious support starts to look like, not just aid packages, but learning loops, manufacturing loops, and institutional commitment. And then there is another layer here that makes this even more important. According to AP, between November and March, Russia launched 27,000 Shahed-type drones, nearly 600 cruise missiles, and 462 ballistic missiles at Ukraine, according to Fedorov. So when Zelenskyy spends his diplomatic capital on air defense systems, drone production and joint manufacturing, that is not because it sounds modern or impressive. It is because Ukraine is under industrial-scale aerial pressure and needs industrial-scale answers. That is also why Zelenskyy said Ukraine's top diplomatic priority is getting allies help to buy and build more air defense systems. This is not optional for them anymore, that is pure survival. But then there is one more uncomfortable fact here. Zelenskyy also said that the shortage of Patriot air defense systems, and missiles obviously, is basically as bad as it gets, with Ukrainskaya Pravda reporting that he described a severe shortage and said that the situation could not be worse. So yes, Ukraine is innovating, yes, Europe is stepping in, but no, this does not mean that the pressure is gone. It simply means that Kyiv is building the next layer of resilience while still operating under acute constraints today. And that tension between innovation and shortage is exactly what makes the next part of this story so important. But before we continue, guys, if you want the detailed map-level continuation of this story with the full frontline update, the exact directions, and why some of these recent changes matter more than the raw square kilometer number suggests, please go ahead and check the Patreon link down below for the exclusive bonus chapter. Your Patreon memberships are the best way to support our work here on YouTube. Thank you so much. Let's continue. Here is where it gets interesting. While everyone watches the headline military aid meetings in Berlin and Oslo, Ukraine is still doing something that keeps forcing the Kremlin into an ugly trade-off. And that is hitting revenue-linked and industrial targets deep inside Russia. Reuters reported that Rosneft was diverting oil supplies to the Tuapse refinery from the Black Sea port of Novorossiysk after the terminal, which handles roughly 14% of Russia's crude exports, was heavily damaged in a drone attack. I mean, a port handling around 14% of crude exports is not just a random facility. And the pressure did not just stop there, of course. Ukrainskaya Pravda reported that drones struck a plant in Sterlitamak in Bashkortostan, around 1,500 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. Based on open-source analysis cited in the piece, the target was the Sterlitamak petrochemical plant, which produces aviation fuel, synthetic rubber, phenolic antioxidants, and various chemicals, additives, and hardeners. Again, this is why the old lazy framing that just Ukraine is striking something and Russia misses completely the point. These are not random gestures for headlines. These are attempts to degrade the industrial ecosystem that sustains military operations and logistics. Ukraine's own military leadership is saying this openly now. Oleksandr Syrskyi once again said that Russian forces intensified offensive operations across virtually the entire 1,200-kilometer contact line after changes in the weather. But he also said Ukrainian forces are maintaining a high tempo of strikes on military sites, facilities belonging to Russia's military-industrial complex, and other assets in Russia that support operations. According to Syrskyi, 76 such assets were struck in March alone using deep strike capabilities, including 15 oil refinery facilities. That number is extremely important, because it tells you that these strikes are not isolated. They are a campaign at this point. And this is where the economic chapter becomes really weird for Moscow, because on paper Russia got a boost in March. Reuters, citing the International Energy Agency, said that Russia's crude oil and refined product export revenues nearly doubled to about 19 billion from 9.75 billion in February, as global oil prices surged and crude exports rose by 270,000 barrels per day to 4.6 million barrels per day, while crude production climbed to 8.96 million barrels per day. So the Kremlin can point to that and say, look, our energy machine is pretty much alive, it's fine. But the same reporting also says infrastructure damage from Ukrainian strikes may constrain further production growth, especially at Baltic and in the Black Sea facilities. In other words, Russia is earning more now, partially because the world got uglier, not because its own underlying position suddenly became safer. And if that was not enough irony for one day, then the United States also extended a waiver allowing Lukoil-owned gas stations outside Russia to keep operating. Which shows how messy sanctions enforcement still is, when real-world supply chains, ownership structures, and downstream markets are involved. This is exactly why the economic side of the war never behaves like a clean morality play. One arm of Western policy is supporting Ukraine's defense industrial buildup, while another arm still has to navigate the complicated afterlife of Russian commercial assets abroad. That does not obviously raise pressure on Moscow, but it does remind you that sanctions regimes are never as clean, neat or absolute as politicians love to imply. So, what does this all mean? It means Ukraine's deep strike strategy is still one of the most rational things it is doing. If Russia wants to fund pressure through oil, then hitting ports, refineries, petrochemical plants and logistic nodes is not just some side quest for Ukraine. It is one of the few levers Ukraine has to complicate Moscow's entire business model. And the more Europe helps Ukraine scale drones and long-range systems, the more dangerous that campaign can become over time. Which brings us to the next chapter. Because when you combine battlefield adaptation with strikes on the war economy, you start getting a much broader geopolitical shift that Europe can no longer pretend is simply temporary. Now here's where things get tricky. For a long time, European support for Ukraine was talked about as if it were mainly about transfers, stockpiles and emergency packages. But what we are seeing right now is a much more consequential transition from aid to co-production. And that matters, because co-production is harder to reverse, harder to politically unwind, and much more useful in a long war. AP reported that Ukraine's top priority is securing help to buy and build more air defense systems, and that Zelenskyy was moving across European capitals to lock in military and financial support from Germany and Norway ahead of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group meeting attended by Boris Pistorius, John Healey and Mark Rutte. The British announcement fits right into that pattern as well. The UK said it will provide at least 120,000 unmanned aerial vehicles to Ukraine by the end of this year in its largest ever drone package, with deliveries already beginning this month. And then John Healey said that the package would include long-range attack drones, reconnaissance drones and logistics drones. This is not just more of the same. This is Europe internalizing what this war has taught. Drones are no longer just boutique tools. They are mass tools. They are now basic war-fighting infrastructure. And once that realization sets in, everything changes. Because if Ukraine becomes not just a recipient of weapons, but a core laboratory and a production partner for Europe's future military technology, then Russia has a much bigger problem than just today's shipment numbers. Russia then faces a long-term block-level adaptation process. That is why these Berlin and Oslo deals matter beyond the immediate headlines. They are a part of a reorganization of European defense thinking around Ukrainian experience, Ukrainian feedback loops as well, and Ukrainian battlefield validation. Stoire openly said Norway wants to learn from what Ukraine has learned in combat. And that sentence alone tells you how far the conversation has moved. But there is still a brutal vulnerability sitting right in the middle of all of this, and that is air defense. Even as allies promise drones and money, Zelenskyy is still emphasizing the need for daily missile supplies and advanced systems, especially Patriot. AP says Ukraine's situation is getting a little complicated because the Iran war is draining stockpiles of advanced air defense missiles. Kyiv's money is also running short, and Russia continues to target civilians and public infrastructure. So the drone revolution, yes, it is real, but it does not eliminate the need for classic strategic air defense. It just complements it. And if that second layer is weak, then Russia still has a way to keep inflicting pressure on the rear. That is also why the overnight numbers matter so much. Russia once again launched 324 drones and 3 ballistic missiles in one night, and Ukrainian air defenses reportedly intercepted 309 of them. That means Ukraine is still performing at a remarkably high defensive level under pressure, but it also means that the Russian model remains clear. Throw enough volume, enough repetition, enough nightly pressure, and eventually you just hope something gets through, something breaks, something runs short, something wears down, something is destroyed. The entire support question for Europe is whether it wants to let that attritional logic continue indefinitely, or whether it wants to build the sort of defense industrial network that can actually outscale it. And that is why this next part matters even more than people think. Because Europe's growing material alignment with Ukraine is not only making Russia angry, it is also feeding a much broader Kremlin narrative that tries to justify escalation, legal expansion, and more confrontation beyond the existing battlefield. Let's talk about it in our final chapter. So all this is not end. Because while Ukraine and Europe talk openly about co-production, air defense and drones, Russia is also signaling in a very predictable, very cynical way that it wants to keep the option of the broader coercion on the table. Ukrainskaya Pravda reported that the Russian State Duma passed at first reading a bill, who would have thought, right? that would allow Putin to legally send troops into other states, supposedly to protect the rights of the Russian citizens. Of course, yeah. Because in Kremlin's language, protecting Russian citizens has a magical way of meaning almost anything they want it to mean. It is one of those phrases that arrives dressed as some kind of a goodwill bureaucracy and just leaves looking like a geopolitical hammer. You should never look at such a bill as just domestic theater, obviously. Yes, part of it is a performance, yes, part of it is a narrative conditioning for the Russian public, but it is also a signal to neighboring states, to Europe especially, and frankly, to anyone still pretending that this war can be isolated inside neat administrative boundaries forever, that simply is not happening. The Kremlin wants legal pretext flexibility. It wants the language ready before the moment arrives. This is how this regime works. First, it builds the phrase, then it builds the excuse, and then it tells everyone that the excuse was inevitable. And this sits alongside another old Russian habit, trying to exploit distraction. The UK's drone package announcement explicitly said that with eyes on the Middle East in recent weeks, Putin wants the world to be distracted. But London will do everything possible to stay focused on what matters. That line alone makes sense because it captures the diplomatic environment perfectly. Russia does not necessarily need everyone to openly side with it. It just needs enough fatigue, enough diversion, enough stockpile stress, enough policy drift, enough delay, enough of these disruptions basically. Ukraine's challenge is to prevent that. Europe's challenge is to prove that its support is not just reactive, but also durable. And that is exactly why the Sea of Azov story matters too, even though it looks at first like just a separate topic. Al Jazeera reports that Ukraine lost all of its Azov after the 2022 invasion, that Russia occupied the full seashore to create a land bridge to Crimea, and that Moscow later declared Azov as its domestic sea, cutting Ukraine from it completely. The loss was obviously a major economic blow, with one expert even saying that Ukraine lost about 10 to 12% of GDP, and possibly much more when the destruction of Mariupol metallurgical plant is counted. But the article also makes a crucial point. Ukraine's loss does not automatically translate into real Russian gain, because the steel plants of Mariupol are unrestorable ruins, as we all know. and Russia's industrial gains there are described as completely almost zero. That is just classic Kremlin strategy in one sentence: destroy immense value, seize ashes, declare victory. So when Moscow talks about bigger legal authorities, bigger escalation narratives, or even bigger regional rights, just remember one thing: what a lot of those gains actually look like in practice. Ruined ports, ruined industry, ruined cities, mass graves buried under cheap reconstruction propaganda. The Kremlin does not need a flourishing future to sell its model. It just needs enough destruction, enough fear, and enough ambiguity to keep moving. So yeah guys, please subscribe and like this video if you found today's briefing useful. If you want the detailed frontline update chapter with the map logic, settlements, pressure points, and the fuller breakdown of where the line is moving and where it is holding, please go ahead and check our Patreon, the link is down below. Thanks so much for watching, for your support, see you on Friday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims are resolve they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in